Part 1, Chapter 1, Book 3. I have now to present an account of the motives which gave occasion for the banishment of Madame de Chevreuse and the other ladies already mentioned. Madame de Chevreuse was one of the first on the list sent from Paris to the Emperor when he was yet at the head of his army after the Battle of Austerlitz. She would therefore have been banished, as well as every other person on the list, had it not been for the protection of some of her friends and her family. Monsieur de Talleyrand was at Vienna and lived on intimate terms with Madame de Lunas, Madame de Chevreuse's stepmother, who availed herself of his services to ward off the blow which threatened her stepdaughter. Monsieur de Talleyrand took advantage of the regard felt by the Emperor for the late Duc de Lunas, who had died a senator and succeeded in representing all the levities of Madame de Chevreuse as mere acts of giddiness. He not only obtained the erasure of her name from the list submitted to the police, but he also caused her to be appointed a lady of the Empress's household. He was probably compelled to frighten her into an acceptance of the appointment, but this was a private matter between them, and it was quite indifferent to the Emperor whether or not Madame de Chevreuse should belong to his household. This, however, was far from being the case with Monsieur de Talleyrand, who considered that lady's appointment as the only means of preserving her from the annoyance she might receive from the police. And in order to conquer her reluctance, he no doubt concerted with Madame de Lunas to frighten her by saying that it was the Emperor's desire she should be a lady of the household, at the same time giving the Emperor to understand that Madame de Lunas's family were desirous of the appointment. An improper use was often made of his name in this manner. Madame de Chevreuse resigned herself to the duty forced upon her, but she always came with evident reluctance to a circle where she received no more than common attentions. She pretended not to notice this apparent slight, and always assumed the airs of a rude and often of an ill-bred woman at a court where she had only been admitted in consequence of the entreaties of her own friends. She was tolerated, but no one saw her with pleasure. At the period of the arrival in France of the Queen of Spain, the Emperor named from Bayonne some ladies of his household to keep that princess company, as she would naturally be at a loss for society at Compiègne. Madame de Chevreuse, who was then at an estate near Paris, was one of the ladies selected. Every consideration had been attended to in such a choice, both as to what might be agreeable to the Queen of Spain and flattering to the pride of Madame de Chevreuse. Madame de la Rochefoucauld, one of the ladies of honor, communicated to the latter the appointment just given to her, intimating at the same time the day on which the Queen was expected to arrive at Compiègne, where she was requested to be in attendance. Nothing could be more unexpected than the manner in which this young lady received the message. She briefly replied that she would not go, not having been brought up to act the part of a jailer. Everyone blamed the manner of her refusal, but her conduct called for some severe mark of disapprobation. It was felt necessary to report it to the Emperor, who recalled the appointment of Madame de Chevreuse and ordered her away to the distance of 40 leagues from Paris. I was solicited during 3 years to procure her recall, and was really at a loss to account for so much meanness displayed for the attainment of that object. After so insolent a conduct on her part, the Emperor was sometimes heard to say, when speaking of that family, "Let them beware. I will show them the distinction I draw between a genealogy of the sword and a genealogy of servants. If they excite my anger, I will revoke the act of confiscation of the property of Marshal Dancre, who was shamefully assassinated, and should his memory be reinstated, heirs will not be wanting to claim his spoils from the family of Lunas, whose wealth was wholly derived from that odious deed." Madame de Staël had not been banished, but she was ordered to a distance from the capital in consequence of an intrigue in which some rivals had involved her. A woman of so much celebrity is often exposed to the consequences of letters pouring in upon her. Such was her situation when I entered the ministry. She has no doubt been told that the Emperor had of his own accord ordered her banishment, But this was by no means the case. I know in what manner the circumstance originated, and can safely assert that when he forced her from her attachment to the world, and ordered her to retire into that country, he only yielded to the repeated entreaties and the unfavorable reports made to him, for it must be acknowledged that he paid far too much deference to her notions of self-consequence and to her work upon Germany. Attempts were at first made to render her more circumspect, but all in vain. She could neither be silenced nor prevented from meddling in and finding fault with everything. She assumed the right to advise, foresee, and control in matters in which the emperor felt himself fully qualified to act upon his own judgment. He grew tired of receiving letters direct from Madame de Stael, and of finding the same subjects discussed in those which she wrote to her friends, who regularly sent them for the emperor's perusal. And to get rid of this annoyance, he sent her to distribute her advice at a distance from him. She soon regretted the capital and often wrote to me to obtain her recall under a variety of pretexts. She at last feigned the determination of going to America, but was betrayed by one of her friends to whom she had divulged her real plan. I was aware that it was first of all her intention to come to Paris, and that with respect to the voyage to America, she would afterwards consider of it. That is to say, she would take time to make up her mind on the subject. Personally speaking, I was rather disposed to yield to her request than to refuse it. I had, in fact, no motive for opposing it, because it must have been a desirable object for Madame de Stael to be on good terms with the Minister of Police. Such an arrangement, therefore, might have been suitable to both, but in order to acquire her good opinion, which I was by no means certain of obtaining, I should have begun by making myself many enemies amongst her immediate friends, whose hostility I was not at all disposed to excite. She could not have gained anything, and I must have lost by the bargain. I was afraid to run the risk of improving her situation, and although I pitied her for having created in our men of wit a feeling of jealousy towards each other, my mind was made up in respect to her by the passport she had asked for to America. I took care not to be the dupe of her cunning, or in other words, that she should not place me under the necessity of recurring to measures which were repugnant to my feelings. A great outcry has been raised against the banishment of Madame Récamier. Nothing, in fact, is more common than to speak right or wrong upon every subject. The unsuccessful speculations of the house of Récamier, which compelled Madame Récamier to retire to a country life, were well known to everyone. Nothing on her part could be more honorable, but she had no right to pass herself off for the victim of tyranny, and to write such nonsense to everyone. It would have been much more correct to tell them at once that the fortune of the house had been lost by bad speculations, than to accuse the emperor as the author of that loss. Madame Récamier had a motive for leading a provincial life, and she told her admirers, who pressed her returning to Paris, that it did not rest with her to do so, thereby inducing the inference that she was prevented by the emperor, although she was farthest from his thoughts. He accordingly gave orders that if she returned, she should no longer be allowed to collect about her person that circle of discontented people, amongst whom she affected to give vent to her grief. I owe it to candor to acknowledge that I wrote to her to desire, among other things, that she should dismiss from her mind all thoughts of coming to Paris for the present. She had not contemplated it, but still she was pleased at the order of banishment, which afforded her a ready pretext for replying to the solicitations of a crowd of friends, with whom she was glad of the excuse. I was also influenced by another motive, one which personally interested herself. I wished to spare her from the unpleasant consequence of her contemplated journey to Switzerland, which have necessarily occasioned. If she should read this work, she will know what I mean. Should I ever have the satisfaction of paying my respects to her, with every apology on my part for the freedom, I shall let her know how correctly I was informed of everything that related to her, and she will then think herself beholden to me for inducing her to remain at Lyons. That my information was correct is sufficiently proved by my having seen in the apartments of a German prince the splendid painting which Monsieur Girard has made of that elegant lady, who substituted her portrait in lieu of the original in the palace of the above prince. Madame Récamier's animosity against the emperor may be said, however, to date from the earliest days of the consulate. The following account will prove how groundless were its motives. During Lucian's embassy to the Spanish court, he had occasion to entrust his dispatches for Paris to one of the personal friends who had accompanied him to Spain. The latter, on his way through Dax, stopped at the residence of Monsieur Michin, the prefect of the Department of the Lands, and amongst other communications which the prefect entrusted to him for the first consul respecting the situation of his department, he acquainted him with the unceasing endeavors he had fruitlessly made for the purpose of discovering the origin of a publication replete with the grossest insults, not only against the government, but also against the person of the first consul and the several members of his family. This publication found its way regularly into the department and was mysteriously conveyed to the houses of several individuals. Monsieur Michin handed 7 numbers of it to this express, who immediately took his departure for Bordeaux. The commissary of police in that city was in the same dilemma as Monsieur Michin, complained of the same publication, and delivered 4 additional numbers of it to the express, who arrived at the residence of the first consul in Paris with 11 of those numbers, which were forthwith transmitted to Monsieur Fouché, the then Minister of Police. This minister soon ascertained through the inquiries which he set on foot that the publication was edited in Paris by an Abbé Guyot, who availed himself of the friendship subsisting between him and Monsieur Bernard, the father of Madame Recamier, who was one of the directors of the post office, to transmit the publication to all those places with which he kept up an official intercourse, from whence it was thrown into general circulation. The discovery gave rise to Monsieur Bernard's arrest, and he was soon afterwards brought to the Ministry of Police and questioned respecting the fact. This occurrence took place on the very day of Madame Recamier's calling at the Ministry of Police to inquire into the cause of her father's arrest, when he made protestations of his innocence and asked permission to have an interview with him, which was immediately granted to her. She saw him at the hotel of the Ministry of Police, obtained the information she desired, which immediately silenced her complaints. She became alarmed at the probable consequences of the discovery, and as the only means of parrying the blow, proposed the surrender of the office held by her father, who tendered his resignation, which was instantly accepted. The first consul heard no more of the matter and ordered Monsieur Bernard to be set at liberty, but Madame Recamier was insensible to this act of benevolence and retained all her asperity, which she instilled into the minds of her numerous admirers. No other females but the 3 above named had been sent into banishment. The men who suffered from it consisted of a very few individuals who were thereby compelled to renounce their usual habits of life. For with respect to those who had at all times lived upon their estates, they assuredly felt no inconvenience from the measure. Monsieur de Duras was almost the only individual who had in the first instant been banished at some distance. By degrees, however, he had taken up his residence so near Paris that he frequently came there without receiving the smallest molestation. Some public notice was taken of these visits, though not until he had returned to the country, and merely to prevent their too frequent repetition. No indication was ever given of his having been seen until he had gone back to the department in which he resided. Monsieur de La Salle had the character of being a turbulent man, capable of embarking in any daring enterprise. His intentions were sound whilst he resided in Burgundy, where the opinion entertained of him was fully borne out by his conduct, for he took a decided part even before the events of the month April 1814 had occurred. Monsieur de Montron, likewise, had been banished to Antwerp. I have myself had occasion to inform him of the name of the individual to whom he was indebted for his disgrace. The emperor did no more than give his sanction to the measure proposed to him. I have now given a faithful account of the banishments in force in July 1810, against which such an outcry has been raised. This clamor would excite no other feeling than that of contempt, had it not occasioned heavy misfortunes, and been, as it were, the cause of the daily inroads made upon the consideration and respect due to the then existing government. It may not be inaptly remarked in this place that the zenith of the emperor's power, which was immediately after his marriage, he might have given an unbounding loose to the pretended spirit of despotism, the thirst for arbitrary measures which have been ascribed to him. Nevertheless, it was at this period that he dispensed graces and favors in the greatest profusion. I could perceive that an impression had been conveyed to literary men that he considered them as his enemies, and I began from that moment to entertain a settled opinion with respect to the course resorted to for the purpose of alienating many of them from his interests, as he had particularly enjoined me to treat them with every consideration. I sought an opportunity which soon presented itself of cultivating their acquaintance. A variety of poetical effusions had been addressed to the emperor on the occasion of his marriage, and he desired me to give him every information, not, as it may well be supposed, in respect to the productions, but concerning the authors. For although I was not insensible to the effect produced by reading them or hearing them recited, it was far above my capacity to discuss their respective merits. I had all those literary productions collected and ordered that those which had obtained most approbation should be pointed out to me, and with them all the compositions published under similar circumstances from the time of Louis XIV, and considered worthy of being handed down to us. The only one that could be pointed out of the latter class was an ode entitled La Nymphe de la Seine, a production of Racine in his younger days on the occasion of the marriage of the Dauphiness. It is less copious, and in my opinion less elegant, than the greater part of those which the emperor's marriage had inspired. An opportunity was thus afforded me, whilst executing the emperor's orders, of giving him an account of each author, and of letting him know that the poetical effusions which that columns of the newspapers had been levied from these authors by my predecessor's commands. The emperor became indignant upon hearing this. I had been told so, was his reply, but I was unwilling to credit it. Thus he proceeded in everything, and I am consequently accused of being my own panegyrist. He was greatly hurt at such conduct. He directed that I should submit to him a scale of the distribution of 100,000 francs, which he was desirous of awarding to the general persons who had displayed their talents on the present occasion, adding that it was doing him a very unworthy service not to recompense authors whose labors had been rendered compulsory, had he in fact lost sight of their claims. They would never have heard the gratuities I delivered to them in his name, and would have been justified in complaining of him, though he could in reality have been arraigned with as little justice for forgetting them as he had been for the orders they had received. It thereby came to my knowledge that the system of ordering poetical effusions was another of the means resorted to by the police to acquire wealth. When, however, this system had been so usefully applied to private purposes, there should be an end to that unblushing impudence of publishing to the world that the man whose liberalities were a source of personal wealth to individuals, and who received a profusion of praises wholly unsolicited, was a tyrant doomed to destruction. The distribution of the above-mentioned sum to the several persons for whom it was destined afforded me an opportunity of seeing them all in succession. I never omitted to peruse immediately after the visit of each author the piece of poetry he had composed, my curiosity being then awakened respecting him, and I seldom failed in to discover something of the author's character by a comparison of his physiognomy with the production which could only have emanated from the dictates of his heart. Chapter 2. On this occasion, I first became intimately acquainted with Monsieur de Esmenard. I had read his poem on navigation, and was at a loss to account for the author of so splendid a production having laid himself open to the calumnies heaped upon him. When he became attached to me, I undertook to relieve him in his difficulties. The means of being generous had been amply afforded me by the fortune which I had received from the emperor, as well as by the advantages of the post I occupied. I afforded assistance to Mr. Esmenard, and by disengaging his mind from the troubles which oppressed it, I found in him a man wholly devoted to me, and of a distinguished talent, which he unreservedly and at all times employed in my service. He never swerved from his attachment to myself, felt a sincere affection for the emperor, and was never apprehensive of making the truth known to me. I have more than once had to lament the void created by his death. Through him, I became acquainted with literary men, both in what concerned them personally and in respect to their talents. I was prepared for his speaking with great asperity of others, owing to the number of his enemies. My good opinion of him was therefore greatly enhanced by noticing his reserved language concerning those who were remorseless in their rage against him. I am only alluding to Monsieur Esmenard with reference to our mutual intercourse. In other respects, this highly talented man caused me much uneasiness, for the jealousy which he inspired raised all the votaries of Parnassus against his patron. According as I have become acquainted with all our accommodations, I found that this learned society was ruled by a party who watched every vacancy amongst its members in order to procure the appointment of some of their friends, and that however great might be a claim on the score of merit beyond their own circle, it was in vain to hope for admission. It occurred to me to have some of my friends placed among the competitors, not through any feeling of self-love, but in order to secure the means of repelling any attacks that might be directed from that quarter. For I anticipated the frequency, and especially the danger of such attacks, considering that any branch of literature I might chance to neglect would therefore become a powerful weapon of offense against the Minister of Police. I felt, moreover, alarmed at the quantity of books brought to me every week, and if I had not employed a score of people to peruse and notice anything reprehensible in them within as short a period as the spirit of malevolence could have gleaned extracts from the works and adapted them to its own wicked purpose, my whole time would have been taken up in counteracting the intrigues which would have been set on foot for the express purpose of defeating my measures. I therefore formed the plan of procuring Monsieur Esmenard's admission into the academy, and exerted myself with so much success that I obtained for him that majority of votes without which he would have infallibly been thrown out. I was assisted in my views by placemen who belonged to the class of belles lettres. I became emboldened by this small triumph, and Monsieur Chenier having died soon afterwards, I endeavored to procure Monsieur de Chateaubriand's admission. I succeeded in securing his appointment, and had I rendered no other service to science, I should consider this as a signal one. His reception, however, was attended with difficulties which he could not be prevailed upon to surmount. He may have felt himself justly offended at a measure to which the Academy body thought proper to subject him. Ministry of Police, Monsieur Etienne J. Tissot Michaud. I felt anxious for the society of a limited circle of men equally commendable for their talents and for their enlightened knowledge. I was personally acquainted with Monsieur Etienne, whom I had met at the camp, and was aware that Emperor's high esteem for him, but Monsieur Etienne felt an invincible reluctance to coming in contact with the Minister of General Police by interference of Monsieur Arnaud, a member of the Institute and a man worthy of every regard. I succeeded on the death of Monsieur Esmenard, though not till then, in persuading Monsieur Etienne to accept of the vacant division, which had not the slightest connection with the rest of the ministry. The Emperor approved of this choice, and Monsieur Etienne's sound judgment and the correctness of his deportment amply justified it to my mind. I might cite many noble traits in the character of this individual, whose brilliancy of talent was only equaled by the probity of his heart. Monsieur J. was only known to me by his reputation of being a man of great wit and learning, after accompanying to Italy the Duke of Otranto, who had confided the classical education of his children to his care. He quitted that minister on his embarkation at Leghorn for the United States of America, and just returned to Paris. Mr. J. felt apprehensive of the prejudices with which he supposed me to be tainted against all those who had belonged to the Duke of Otranto. I did not leave him long in a state of uncertainty, but sent for him, and was so well satisfied with his appearance, his political sentiments, which he made no attempt to disguise, and his moderation of language, that I resolved to attach him to my department in any manner most agreeable to his own feelings. I trusted him with the task of translating and analyzing the English publications, with which the Ministry of Police was abundantly supplied, through the medium of the police commissaries at Bologna. Monsieur J. accompanied his reports to me upon those productions, with remarks on their political tendency. His labors were regularly transmitted to the Emperor, who has often desired me to signify to the author his approbation of them. He ordered me, sometimes afterwards, to place the Journal de Paris under his special management. Monsieur Michaud had been named to me in the most flattering terms. He was at that time engaged on his splendid work on the subject of the Crusades. I took every opportunity of drawing him to my hotel, and had as much reason to be satisfied with his attachment as others had to appreciate his talents. He was sincerely devoted to the imperial government. The emperor, who was a better judge than I was of the character and dispositions of men in general, and who valued his sentiments no less than his talents, ordered me to place him on the list of gratifications at the time of the distribution of shares in the Gazette de France. The emperor never afterwards forgot him in any of the gratuities which he bestowed upon literary men. I have never had reason to repent of my intercourse with M. Michel, who on his part never had occasion to complain of my conduct towards him. This is an act of justice which I do not apprehend he would withhold from me. I had heard of M. Tissot as the author of several literary productions. I also knew that he was indebted to the emperor for having escaped falling a victim to the base resentment of his implacable enemies, who had exerted their utmost endeavors to include him amongst those who suffered transportation after the affair of the third Nivosa. Moved by the presentations of M. Monge Berthier, Conviceres, and of Madame Bonaparte, who had long been acquainted with him, the first consul himself struck his name out of that list. But as he was still urged to remove him, at least 2 distances from Paris, he directed the strictest inquiry to be instituted into M. Tissot's conduct during the period of the Revolution, and from the circumstance that no charge was found against him, General Bonaparte had occasion to discover how great was the animosity of private feelings on the occasion, and he accordingly restored him to his family. Subsequently to that period, 2 men, whose minds were worked upon by party spirit, came to confide to him the intention that they had formed of attempting on the first consul's life. Their absolute indifference to life might secure the success of their criminal attempt. They renounced it on M. Tissot's remonstrating with them. This meritorious action had remained buried for many years in profound oblivion. Chance made me acquainted with the fact, which I hastened to communicate to the emperor. He was affected at the recital, and then related to me how he had saved M. Tissot from most imminent danger, at a moment when everyone sought to gratify private revenge under favor of the opportunity presented by the horrible attempt of the third Nivosa. I disguised this circumstance from M. Tissot, as I was indeed bound to do, and he will remain in ignorance of it until he reads this work, but it gave me the desire of becoming personally acquainted with him. He was then leading a retired life, and only intent upon literary pursuits and upon the duties of a situation in the excise department, the director of which, M. Francois de Nantes, one of the wittiest men in France, entertained a particular regard for him. We had a frank and open interview together. I had not at that time in my department any place worthy of his acceptance. I merely asked him if he would undertake to point out to my notice those works in literature and arts which were entitled to public attention, as well as every rising genius who was deserving of encouragement. I considered a matter of the highest importance and a personal satisfaction to contribute to the success of the objects of his choice. M. Tissot consented to take upon himself this description of labor, and performed it with alacrity and kindness. Many persons were unconsciously indebted to him for the honorable rewards bestowed upon him by the emperor. He particularly befriended young men and was ardent in promoting their interests. At a later period, the emperor directed me to confide the direction of the Gazette de France to M. Tissot's management. On the death of Abbé Delille, who had selected him for his substitute in the professorship of Latin poetry, the emperor's mind was immediately directed to M. Tissot, and he felt gratified at his being proposed to him by the votes of the College of France and of the Institute as Abbé Delille's successor. M. Tissot was accordingly vested with the title of professor. The emperor always set a high value on the rectitude and sound judgment of that writer. I recollect his once sending for him during the period of the 100 Days. By the aid of this little Areopagus, I found myself in a condition to paralyze the effects of prejudices and the spirit of malevolence which ascribed to me hostile intentions and sentiments utterly foreign to my thoughts, since I considered, on the contrary, from my first entrance into the ministry, that in order to be really useful to the emperor, I was bound to keep within the limits of moderation and to be proof against the workings of personal animosity, I was particularly desirous of propitiating literary men by exalting their success and their dignified attitude in a literary and a political point of view. Those truly valuable men whose attachment I had courted gave me the most effectual support by the kindness and zeal they evinced in distinguishing every species of talent. With respect to the influence I was supposed to exercise over those writers, every one who has the publications of that period to refer to can readily satisfy himself that they never refrained from professing openly at that time certain principles which on many occasions since the Restoration would have brought them before the correctional police. The government, however, was secure in its own strength. Its theory was of a truly national character. All minds and all parties were united in its support. Any person who might have attempted to sow the seeds of discord would have been considered as a madman. However great the freedom with which any opinion might be expressed, it gave us no uneasiness. I challenge those writers to point out a single instance of my having invited or authorized them to resort to subterfuge or deception in order to turn the public mind into any particular channel. Feeling strong in my own innocence, I am so fully convinced that they never would have consented to any degrading act of subserviency. So great was their innate spirit of independence. And the emperor has perhaps never heard on certain subjects such severe truths as I occasionally collected from their conversations, which were carried on with perhaps much less restraint than anywhere else in Paris, though not one of them ever had cause to apprehend any evil consequence from it. The freedom of their discourse was ever reported to the emperor by persons whose official zeal is always on the alert when an injury is to be inflicted. I was beginning to acquire a thorough knowledge of duties which I was quite ignorant of a few months before, and was now much less apprehensive of the collision into which I was forced with every species of human imperfections. Chapter 3. The frightful accident of the fire in the ballroom of Prince Schwarzenberg's hotel occurred in the month July or August 1810. The prince gave a grand ball on the occasion of the emperor's marriage with the daughter of his sovereign. I believe that the ball given on the same occasion by the Imperial Guard did not take place till some time afterwards. The whole city of Paris was present at the later fête, which was given at the military school without the occurrence of the slightest accident. It happened otherwise, however, at the Austrian ambassador's hotel. A spacious ballroom had been erected of very slight framework near the principal suite of apartments and protected by a cloth awning richly covered over. The architect, trusted with the construction, had confined himself principally to a display of elegance and taste. This spacious and splendidly decorated ballroom was lighted up by an immense number of lustres suspended from the ceiling, and the entrance to it was through a gallery decorated in the same tasteful manner. The ballroom and its approaches were soon filled with the company invited. The emperor and empress, the queen of Westphalia, the vice queen of Italy had arrived, and the pleasures of the dance were at their height when a wax candle, which was accidentally bent, set fire to one of the garlands of artificial flowers which decorated the walls of the gallery. The fire, owing to the current of air, spread with the rapidity of lightning and soon reached the ballroom, which was instantly in a blaze. The emperor was in the center of the room. He was waiting for the assistance of the firemen and was much displeased at their delay. As the danger increased every moment, he led the empress back to the Tuileries and returned to see what was going forward in Prince Schwarzenberg's hotel, being apprehensive that this dreadful accident would be attended with severe misfortunes. He had no sooner retired with the empress than a panic spread in all directions. The passages were encumbered with people flying from the scene and endeavoring to effect their escape. The Prince Kurakin, the Russian ambassador, fell down a few steps leading from the ballroom into the garden, which had escaped his notice, and he was trampled upon by the crowd. As he was unable to rise immediately from the ground, the flames caught him in that position and did him so serious an injury as to place his life for a long time in imminent danger. The main boards of this light structure were consumed in an instant, and its spacious entrance door fell with all the lustres upon those who had not yet been able to effect their escape. The firemen gave no proof of activity on the occasion. It must be admitted that under no circumstances could they have saved the ballroom, but they had been fully prepared to act. They might have so far stopped the progress of the flames as to afford everyone time to retire. Very engines were without water, and upwards of half an hour elapsed before they were able to play upon the fire. The emperor was present, did not withdraw until it was completely extinguished. He shared in the affliction of Prince Schwarzenberg, to whom he addressed the most consoling expressions. He sent for the prefect of the police, to whom he expressed his displeasure in the strongest terms, and I think he formed on that day the determination of displacing him as soon as he should find a person competent to assume the duties of that office. It required a man fully competent to enter into all the details which are connected with it, and few persons are calculated to go effectually through such a task. As soon as the fire was got under, the emperor returned to St. Cloud and sent me orders to wait upon him at an early hour the next morning with an account of the consequences of the accident. It was not until daylight that the body of Princess Schwarzenberg, the lady of the ambassador's elder brother, was discovered under the remains of the burnt timber of the ballroom. She had succeeded in extricating herself, but had returned in search of her children, not having seen them effect their escape. She had hardly got under the blazing roof when the woodwork gave way and so crushed and consumed her that she was only distinguished by some remains of the jewels she had worn to the fete. The Countess of Delayan died of her wounds a few days afterwards, as well as the wife of the Russian Consul General and Madame Tussaud, the wife of a general officer of artillery. Several others were seriously wounded and experienced prolonged sufferings from the effects of that dreadful accident, which was for a long time the exclusive topic of conversation in France. A very singular correspondence came at that period into my hands. It pointed out the accident which had occurred on the marriage of the Dauphiness, the late Queen of France. Everyone spoke of the strong analogy between the two accidents, and everyone went so far as to conjecture the occurrence of events which would have appeared ridiculous to the most senseless understanding, and which have nevertheless been in a great measure verified. It is no exaggeration to assert that the idea was generally prevalent of there being an evil destiny inseparable from our alliance with Austria. That opinion was gaining ground, and I had to combat many difficulties before I could succeed in paralyzing its unpleasant effects. I have already related that after making a division in the system of vigilance which I was exercising over Paris, I discovered nothing of sufficient consequences to create alarm, and began to consider the capital under another aspect. I will explain my meaning. I merely beheld the mischief which had been done, and while seeking for the origin of it, other mischief was springing up. I was already enabled to discover that the emperor's facility of access furnished malicious people many opportunities of reporting stories to him as proceeding from such and such class of society, or from speculating men, who in order to favor their operations were endeavoring to suppress the funds. I had remarked that, generally speaking, these stories grew out of the imaginations of some crazy or idle people who abused the free access they had to the sovereign, to profess a zeal for his service and to favor at the same time certain views of private ambition. The exclusive confidence of the emperor appeared to be a bone of contention between a few individuals who watched every opportunity of forcing their friends and dependents into places of trust upon his person, in order to surround him with an atmosphere wholly devoted to their interests. I was witness to the impudence with which the most knavish intrigues were carried on for the purpose of introducing dependents into every branch of the emperor's household, after attempting to grasp at the nominations to the ranks of Grand Marshal, Grand Equerry, and Grand Chamberlain. It was at last attempted to secure the appointments to the emperor's closet. The following was the organization of that closet. What was specifically called the private closet had only one secretary, called the Secretary of the Portfolio, a situation held by M. de Meneval. This arrangement continued until his return from Russia, when the state of his health compelled the emperor to appoint a person to succeed him, after placing him, however, near the person of the empress in the capacity of her private secretary on his establishing the regency, and with instructions to correspond daily with him during his absence from the capital. M. Fane, the keeper of the records, occupied a separate apartment with the archives, where the papers of the private closet were never deposited until the complete disposal of the business to which they related. He never entered the emperor's closet unless summoned, and for no longer time than the emperor required his presence. Messieurs Meunier and de Ponton, secretaries of the closet, occupied in common a separate office. The former had the charge of translating foreign newspapers, and the translators selected to assist him were persons of his own choice. He received for this duty 50,000 francs a year, notwithstanding which I regularly sent to the emperor the English newspapers, ready translated in consequence of their coming first into my own hands. Monsieur de Ponton was entrusted with the business connected with fortifications and had therefore less duties to perform. To Monsieur Delba was assigned the duty connected with maps and charts, and he also occupied a separate apartment with 2 topographical engineers. This division of labor effectually closed the doors to the private closet and other respective offices against any injury. Its efforts were therefore directed towards the Empress, and an attempt was made in that quarter to force its agents into responsible places. Its first trial was that of endeavoring to raise Monsieur de Narbonne to the situation of Grand Master of the household. But although the Emperor was well pleased with Monsieur de Narbonne, he nevertheless refused his consent to that appointment, to which the Empress was still more averse than himself. Monsieur de S strained every nerve to procure the place of private secretary to the Empress. In the first instance, for a Monsieur de Guilvoisin, his dependent, and afterwards for Monsieur Ferrand, who acquired such celebrity in 1814 by the different situations he held under the royal government. But the Emperor had his secret motives for turning a deaf ear to all those hints. He would only place near the Empress a person of unimpeachable fidelity, and was accordingly under the necessity at a later period of parting with Monsieur de Meneval, who was notwithstanding so useful to his service. I was one of the first to discover what would be the consequence of this unfortunate medley created by the readiness with which any expression thrown out against a person whom it was endeavored to ruin was made to circulate in such a manner as to reach the Emperor's ears. I had the courage to open my mind very freely to the Emperor on this subject, both with respect to what I was witness to and what was reported to me. I never concealed anything from his knowledge, and experience has too well proved how unworthy of his esteem and affection were those men who contended for his favors, and considered as the infliction of a personal injury every mark of benevolence which he showed to his most faithful adherents. The Emperor, who has so long been represented as of a gloomy and mistrustful character, was on the contrary kind even to a fault, and reposed unbounded confidence in those who had never proved unfaithful to him. His disposition rather inclined him to think well of others than to suspect them, until, to use his own expression, he had actually caught the hand dipping in the bag. Nothing short of a deep-laid scheme could succeed in shaking his good opinion of anyone. The only reproach to which he appeared to me to have given some cause on this point was that when he discovered any deception attempted to be practiced upon him, he never expressed in sufficiently strong terms his displeasure to those calumniators who were encouraged by this impunity to renew their evil designs. He would have spared himself much trouble and vexation had he inflicted a signal punishment for the first calumny reported to him. I have said that it was in his nature to confide in the fidelity of all those who were about his person. I will mention an instance in proof of this assertion, which I select out of a multitude of cases I might easily bring forward. I accompanied him as his aide-de-camp to a review which he held the 7th Regiment of Hussars at Vienna after the Battle of Wagram. He was making appointments to the vacant ranks and distributing rewards amongst the officers and soldiers who had been wounded during the campaign. The colonel of the 4th Regiment urged him to break an officer who was not present at the review and lived in Vienna in the most degrading state of debauchery, from which it was found impossible to withdraw him. Even then, his duty should have called him to the field of honor on the occasion of the Battle of Wagram. The Emperor not only broke him on the spot, but ordered that he should be made an example of, and told the Prince of Neuchâtel, who took note of it accordingly, that he was to procure the arrest of that officer and bring him before a council of war. Previously to leaving the ground, the Emperor filled up his place by one of the lieutenants of the regiment. It was the practice to submit for the Emperor's signature in the afternoon of the day on which he had passed any corps in review the final decree for the several appointments he had made. The Prince of Neuchâtel served him with zeal, which greatly contributed to secure him the affection of the soldiers. They were satisfied that the Emperor no sooner issued an order in which their interests were concerned than the Prince immediately carried it into effect. when he had given his signature to any official document, it was immediately sent from his closet to the office of the Secretary of State, from whence, after it had been regularly inserted in the minutes, it was transmitted to the different branches of the administration to which it more immediately related. The decree for the dismissal of the officer of hussars and that for filling up the appointment to his rank were accordingly sent to that office. There was no possibility of evading their execution, but the Prince of Neuchâtel's mind was so successfully worked upon that the council of war did not take place. The officer dismissed returned back to Paris for 2 months after the emperor's arrival. The same patronage procured his being nominated one of the chamberlains. Great care was taken to remove from the emperor the slightest suspicion that a rank in his household was conferred upon the very officer of hussars who had been dismissed 2 months before. This is not all. That officer's interest was sufficiently powerful to procure his being reinstated in the army in less than 2 years. He became chief of a squadron and a member of the Legion of Honor. I was not aware that this chamberlain was the officer of hussars who had been denounced in my presence by his own regiment. It was not till a long time afterwards that I mentioned the circumstance to the emperor in order to convince him how deep was the artfulness of intrigue when it could succeed in introducing into his household those men who had no other merit than to be faithful reporters out of doors of whatever came there under their notice. The same care was taken to introduce into the households of several members of his family all those whose services were thought available for the purpose of injuring the individuals who already held employments in them. The emperor expressed himself greatly dissatisfied at having been thus imposed upon, but we were too deeply involved in difficulties to have it in our power to alter the course which had so long been pursued. Every circumstance of this nature which came under my notice had the effect of giving me a disgust for the functions of the ministry of police. I had the choice of 2 evils, either to practice daily impositions upon the emperor by being an accomplice of those wretched intriguers, or subject myself to unceasing vexations by attempting to defeat them. I could not act a neutral part on that occasion. I compounded with such as were calculated to produce dangerous results by warning the principal actors in them, that others beside myself had their eyes open to the imperfections which abound in the world, that I heartily wished, for their sakes, I were the only one likely to interfere with their improper proceedings, but gave them notice that if their names are ever brought in question, I should not be withheld from divulging everything I knew regarding them by any apprehension of the consequences. I kept my word. There were, however, some few persons of both sexes having to complain of severity exercised towards them, having both suspected and arraigned me as the cause of what had happened to them. This was the more unjust on their part, as I was fully acquainted with everything that related to them, and so far from doing them an injury, have sometimes averted a storm by drawing off the attention to some other subject. I have at this time more than one enemy who owes me a debt of gratitude in this respect, an assertion which there would be no difficulty in proving in the clearest manner. Generally speaking, those disagreeable vexations springing out of the intercourse of society had no foundation whatever. I considered them as the signal for the winding up of some intrigues which had been long hatching, and at the same time as the mask assumed by malevolence when aiming to do anyone injury, I came to the determination of endeavoring to impose upon that description of people rather than be incessantly engaged in counteracting their intrigues. I caused false reports to be circulated, and soon succeeded so effectually in palming them up the credulity of our would-be genteel people. They were brought back to me in the garb of real facts, as some of them were of a satirical tendency and were occasionally leveled at individuals who lived on intimate terms with me. I did not fail to notice the wicked intentions with which the most cutting stories were attributed to persons against whom it was wished to excite my prejudices, and the stories of a contrary character to those on whose behalf it was an object to obtain my good graces. I pretended to believe everything, recompensed the informer's zeal, which only put me in a possession of what emanated from myself, but so long embellished so altered and amplified that I could no longer recognize my own offspring. My purpose was, for a short time, fully answered by this method. But everything falls into disuse, and in Paris, sooner than anywhere else. The more I proceeded on my course, the less I could understand how a powerful state could have occasion for a ministry, the inefficiency of which, not to say its absolute non-entity, were manifested to me. The aspect of the political horizon was before my eyes, but I was blind to its operating causes. Had I acted upon precedents, I could easily have created a clamor and order afterwards to calm it. At times, this course may be found useful, and I have resorted to it when I wished to divert attention from an object I had essentially at heart to secure, but from the pursuit of which a mere look would have detached me. Such a mode of proceeding did not accord with my wishes, and could only be applied to specific operations. I had no longer attained an object. Then I dismissed it from my thoughts. The work to be done, and the discoveries, which still baffled my penetration, were alone calculated to annoy me. To a portion of my voluminous correspondence I bestowed the most unceasing attention. That which related to the world in general I reserved for a mere pastime. By the former, I discovered that Paris exercised a prodigious influence over the departments, and that the metropolis itself was subject to the influence of the government and of foreigners. That which was exerted by the government was felt by all who were in any way connected with or who subsisted by it. Notwithstanding that the number of these was very great, it would have been almost in vain to assign to them the task of forcing public opinion into any particular channel in the event of occurrences which might have mitigated against too many interests. Chapter 4. Public opinion in France may at all times be compared to the atmosphere. It bore an exact proportion to the harmony subsisting between us and the other powers of Europe with respect to our reciprocal intercourse. In times of war, when battles were won, which were calculated to bring about peace, everything went on well. When the contest had been a doubtful issue, the very contrary took place. During peace, the attention of everyone was fixed upon the acts of government and its financial operations, which became at once the guide of those men who stood in need of quiet in order to embark in commercial speculations. The persons opposed to government were also guided by that state of fluctuation. They either revived or lost courage, according as their hopes of success were elevated or depressed by the state of political affairs. A battle lost upon the Elbe was felt for a month afterwards on the banks of the Loire. A successful engagement in the same quarter appeared to be the pledge of long years of tranquility. When fighting was out of the question, there was another thermometer to go by, hope being the only consolation for the unhappy. Intrigues would then come into play until some fortunate circumstance should dictate another attitude. I was thus forced to drag on the whole time of my administration and compelled to be always prepared for every hypothetical case, and none but fools or madmen can believe the French to be so bereft of reason as to open to imposition respecting any occurrence which they have as great an interest in knowing as might be felt in deceiving them by the person who could harbor such a design. This is the truth which immediately struck me, and all my anxiety was exclusively directed to the object of remedying the evil effects of any unpleasant event, without ever attempting to present it under a false aspect. Those who, in their intercourse with the emperor, made this a ground of reproach against me by ascribing it to a want of shrewdness on my part, were mere fools, who deceived the emperor, and him alone, in so far as that he persisted in the system of silence, which allowed evil-minded people to exaggerate what was wrong and to throw the good into the shade. They afterwards pretended that it was necessary to enlighten public opinion and to prevent the language of censure from having such free circulation, their own disappointed hopes serving them as a stimulus for speaking in the terms of reprobation of those whose downfall they had vowed to accomplish. Public opinion is never led astray respecting facts which are well known all over Europe. The French have none of the Hottentot in their composition, and woe betide anyone who might pretend to dupe them with impunity. They are patient and enduring, but they take a signal revenge of injuries. Oh my goodness. They take a signal revenge of injuries when the opportunity offers. And the wretches who, only intent upon the gratification of their own vanity, have drawn down upon a master they perhaps wished to serve, the momentary ill will of the French nation, deserve to bear all the weight of its indignation in return for the injuries they have inflicted upon it.